No, my family's
Yeah.
the family that gets upset if you say the Civil War was about slavery. It's like,
Um,
no, it was states' rights. And I'm like, oh my God. No, we've even had family arguments about how I'm too liberal. So it's like, I don't know how that happened.
oh
But
God.
I know, because I'm not, I mean, to me, I'm not. But we need to
Yeah.
talk about the history stuff, though. It is time to start. Um, if you got in a little bit late, yeah, grading day tomorrow. That should be the catch-up day. So if you've sent an email and I haven't responded, I promise I'm going to go through all the email tomorrow and make sure you didn't miss yours. So apologies if I did. Some of the grading, again, I noticed that, the P word, plagiarism, let's not do that, okay? Because, you don't want to flunk the class. Also, I'm getting the email from your, what's she called, transition coordinator that says, hey, are the kids passing? So I'll respond to that after I do the catch-up grading tomorrow. So if there's something you need to turn in, you haven't, tonight's probably a really good night to do that. Because, yeah, tomorrow will be the day I tell her, like, if I were this person, I would drop. So get caught up if you can in the next day or two if you're behind. Like I'm going to be caught up with grading. All right, let's look at trying to turn it here. Weekly question. Hopefully I picked the one where I didn't write comments. Yes, there we go. So your weekly question is this one, the admittance of Missouri to the Union. Missouri, yes, my home state, sparked a national crisis. This is when my home state wasn't quite so admirable, perhaps. Now it's amazing, of course. Describe the debates that led up to the final compromise. How does the Missouri Compromise illustrate that sectional issues would surely arise again? So sectional issues, of course, North versus South. And, I've already told you that's my home state. And so when I go home and they want to talk about history, I can guarantee you sectional history or sectional issues still arise, which doesn't make me happy, to be honest with you. But just as a gentle reminder, the textbook is the best place always to look for information. So I was peeking to see the page numbers. Sorry, I know I had it open and then of course I closed it. But it's not a super long section for this question. So I think that will make your lives a little easier. 11. Okay, that's why I can't find it. I'm in chapter 12. Chapter 12 is kind of a fun chapter. Well, fun is the wrong word, but lots and lots of talk about reform in chapter 12. And let's see. The second half of this chapter 2 is the Andrew Jackson stuff. Dang, that stuff's crazy. Andrew Jackson. All right, so Missouri Compromise 376 to 378, 79. So super short section, 376 to 378 or 9. Let me type that in the chat if I can figure out where the chat is. Chat. Here it is. I got to count somebody else present, don't I? Pages 376 to 378 on Missouri Compromise. I can't even spell my home state. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, I promise. Okay. Maybe I could be lying. All right. Let me pull up the notes after I count somebody present. There we go. Great. So we're getting into, or we're kind of leaving the section where the Federalist Party disappears, getting into the section where you have the Democratic Republicans, which are really the Republicans in your textbook, and then they kind of transfer to the National Republicans and then turn into the Democrats. So politically, we're in a weird spot. It's a weird spot for sure. And then you get into the Andrew Jackson thing, and then that's some weird stuff. Okay, so What we're starting to see during this era is a bit of a transition from Jeffersonian democracy to Jacksonian democracy. And the idea behind Jeffersonian democracy is that you would pick the best candidate, so the most moral, most ethical, most prepared, best experience, the guy who would represent you best, the guy that you think of as, even better than you are. So you want the best possible person. That's kind of Jeffersonian democracy, where you pick the most ideal candidate. So you just kind of look at their qualifications, and whoever's most qualified, that's who you pick. Excuse me, with the assumption that their values kind of line up with, that qualifies them to be moral and ethical and that sort of thing. So you wouldn't pick somebody who hadn't been a politician before, somebody who hadn't done much public service before, because, you would question their motives. You want somebody better, more prepared, that sort of thing. What you see with Jacksonian democracy, and I'm not trying to suggest that Jackson wasn't prepared or moral or ethical or any of that stuff, although I'm not going to say that I agree that he was all of those things. Certainly some people would, that's all judgment kind of stuff. But Jacksonian democracy is where you kind of pick the guy that you think you can relate to the most, the self-made man, maybe the guy who's most like you, who would represent your concerns best because he's had experiences like yours. So with the Jeffersonian thing, if there were a guy from Harvard or a guy from Texas State, you might go, Harvard's slightly better than Texas State, so I'm going to pick that guy. In the Jacksonian model, if there were the Harvard guy or the Texas State guy, you might go, you know what, I went to Texas State, which I actually did, except it was Southwest Texas State when I was there. I went to Texas State. I trust that guy more because he's clearly more from my background. My background didn't take me to Harvard, so that guy is never going to understand me or understand the average American, so I don't want him. I want a guy who understands the average American. So in the Jacksonian era, you want the self-made man, the guy that can relate to the common man. And I think even in the modern era, we see those kind of thoughts when we talk about politics. I'm going to suggest to you, it's not quite, I think, as complete as maybe the contrast between Jefferson and Jackson. But I'm going to suggest that you may see that in the last two presidential elections, where with President Trump, we picked a guy who maybe didn't have typical experience because we wanted somebody a little different. We wanted, and there's certainly people, I can tell you, my people think that Trump is a guy that can relate to them because he's from the Ozarks and grew up in poverty, or no, that's probably not it. But he's got that common touch. He really does. I mean, where, he just comes off as the average guy, kind of he's definitely unpretentious in some ways, and says what he's thinking. That's the thing that people liked about him. It's just like, here's what I think, here it is. And he'd tweet it, and, we all knew. Or do you want the guy with the more traditional experience like Joe Biden, who's been a politician longer than all of us have been alive? I mean, I think even me, as old as I am, I think he's been a politician longer than I've been alive, and, has that big range of folks that he knows, and he's been a vice president, so he's done his time, he's ready, he knows what to do. So, and I'm not even coming close to suggesting that Biden is like Jefferson as far as intellect, because truthfully, nobody's like Jefferson as far as intellect. That's a super brilliant dude. And I'm not suggesting that, I'm not suggesting anything about Trump or Biden. I'm just saying that I think you see that swing back and forth. During this era, once we get into the 1820s especially, we've really moved away from wanting some old Virginian guy who was part of the founding father core. We don't want that anymore. We want something different. So the last guy that we'll have like that is John Quincy Adams, who's sort of the younger version of that. And then as time goes along, we kind of want these self-made, say what I mean, if you insult me, I'll try to kill you kind of guys, like Andrew Jackson. Mostly just Andrew Jackson is like that, but you'll see campaigns get a little rowdier. a little more raucous and that kind of stuff. It's definitely more entertaining. Although, yeah, people did say bad stuff about Jefferson when he ran for office. Mostly because he read the Quran. Can you imagine? And he also had kids with a slave, and everybody knew that. Even though I can remember when they were exploring Jefferson's genealogy, and they were talking about the secret children of Thomas Jefferson. It's like, wasn't a very good secret because they talked about it during the campaign, but not everybody studies history. Can you believe that? So crazy. All right, so more stuff. All right, so we're going to start valuing experience of the common or self-made man, like Andrew Jackson. And the contrast between Jackson and John Quincy Adams is pretty stark. John Quincy Adams, his dad was a president, his dad was a founding father. He attended Harvard. His dad was a great lawyer. John Quincy had been a diplomat since his early 20s. And Andrew Jackson would have considered him kind of soft and weak and aristocratic, that kind of thing, everything Andrew Jackson wasn't. Jackson was old enough that as a kid, he got captured during the American Revolution. And because he wouldn't help the British, they cut up his face with a sword. So he bore that scar as a badge of honor. He had been orphaned during the Revolutionary War. I think his mom, if I remember the story right, his mom took care of people who got sick during the war, and she ended up getting something. Crud, what did she get? I can't remember if it was smallpox or something along those lines, but she ended up dying, and the dad had already died. So Andrew Jackson's an orphan at about age 14 and gets to take care of his younger brother. He's a scrappy dude. He ends up joining the military, becoming a lawyer, becoming a judge, becoming an incredibly wealthy man, owning a plantation. So he rises to wealth from, just his own hard work, and I know, on the backs of his slaves as well. But he becomes a wealthy man after being a poor man, which is a task. I mean, it's a hard thing to do. So people admired him for that. And as far as the slavery thing, that's going to be one of the biggest disputes that they're going to have during this time period, which is why we have a civil war, or partly why we have a civil war, if you like that better, but it's really why. So, all right. Meaning of citizenship during this era, really the best definition, according to Dr. Foner, who's of course smarter than all of us about history, is that you get to vote. Now, who gets to vote during this time period? White dudes. And I know you're thinking, well, dang, white dudes voting, that's pretty rude. That's not enough people. For that time period, that's a pretty high level of suffrage. So in other countries, really, there's a wealth requirement, or they don't let anybody vote, that sort of thing. So I know that we're leaving out all the women and any dude who's not white. But we're very proud that during this era, we let poor white guys vote. But for the era, that's progress. So I know it's hard sometimes to want to try to measure things by the era they're in, but that's sort of what we're supposed to do a little. I don't mean you can't look back and go, well, that still was not very inclusive, or slavery was still evil. Of course you can do all that stuff, but you also want to recognize what the common opinions were during that era, or what was going on in the rest of the world during that era. So, all right. So citizenship, the right to vote. So we have universal white manhood suffrage during that time period, which means all white guys can vote, whether they own property or not. So even if they're poor, and that's seen as progress. That clearly excludes well over half the population, probably close to 2/3 at this time period, more in the South, of course. So who's excluded? That would be women and not white guys. And why? Because people didn't think, okay, by people I mean white guys, didn't think You know, I say that, and then I was telling the 1302 class that if you look at some of the interviews in the early part of the civil rights movement and you interview people who were victims of segregation, they will say, you know what, we just assumed we were inferior because society said we were. So they didn't really fight back because the system had always put them in a certain place, and they knew fighting back or disagreeing would mean someone might kill you. So, and I'm not necessarily suggesting that people didn't question, but a lot of times people don't question. I mean, they don't. And there were certainly women during this time period who would write and argue that their place was not in politics. And they agreed that getting involved in politics, whether even if it's just voting, would make them less moral. And them being moral is the only thing that kept our society kind of sane and rational, because dudes were out of control, especially white dudes, apparently. But society in general, and certainly most white men, did not see white women of any color and men who were not white as equal intellectually, and of course concerned about the women that they would become immoral if they got more involved in society. I don't know. I hear, I don't know if that's fair. I heard similar arguments after the Grammy Awards and the weird dancing that was going on. It's like, because all women dress and dance like that. That's just what we do. Yeah. All right, and dudes, they probably do that too. I don't know. But during this era, we're also developing something called the American system. Sorry. This is more an economic system that's going to create an internal home market. You're going, of course it does. What I'm trying to say is that we as the United States are going to try to stop importing stuff from our European friends, because we want to make sure that we are economically self-sufficient and we're not dependent on Europe primarily for manufactured goods during this time period. So we want to do something within our country to build up manufacturing. And I know some of you are thinking right now, you're thinking, well, didn't Alexander Hamilton think that? Was that in the musical? I can't remember. But yeah, Alexander Hamilton thought that, but we're past that Federalist generation and that founding generation. That thought kind of went away because remember, we're the nation of small farmers. But now that we're noticing this puts us at an economic disadvantage in a pretty serious way, maybe we shouldn't just be a nation of small farmers. Maybe developing manufacturing could also develop some wealth as well, and we would stop exporting that wealth to other countries. So even in this Republican generation, which is supposed to be a smaller government generation, there's a thought that using federal funds to build up at least infrastructure to support manufacturing would be good. And maybe to continue to support the national bank, because if you follow the national bank, which I know teenagers do, you'll notice that the recharter of the national bank happens during the Madison administration. You go like, of course we knew that. Why wouldn't we know that? And you might remember that certainly Madison would have been one of the people who fought against the national bank. He truly was, but it gets rechartered during his administration because honestly, it's kind of useful. They saw a purpose for it after it was created, and it wasn't quite as elitist as they thought it would be. So the thought was you could use the national bank to help give out loans to companies that wanted to create manufacturing, or manufacturers as they would call it during that time period. And you could use federal funds to actually build up the infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, railroads, to help transport goods across the country. We won't do a lot of that, but we'll talk about that during the Madison administration. We'll talk about it more during the Adams round two, John Quincy administration as well. And then the South will really push back against that, because what they figure out, they're correct, is that those systems, that type of infrastructure improvement is not going to be nearly as helpful to the South as it is to the North. because there isn't going to be a lot of manufacturing in the South because everyone in the South with money is growing cotton. That's a slight overstatement, but it's only slight. So, so there'll be a divide between the North and the South as we move forward about using federal funds for infrastructure because they think that that benefits the North more than the South, mostly because it does. Yeah, it does. But creating a fully functioning internal market could have been beneficial to the South because then they could have sold their cotton to the North rather than overseas. Now, they were making a ridiculous amount of money selling overseas, but my opinion and slight critique of our Southern friends who were growing cotton during that time period, they really weren't thinking long term. They weren't, because their thought was, you know, always the manufacturing will go on in France and England, so that's always where we'll need to sell our cotton. And they weren't really imagining that there would be an internal manufacturing market that develops. It was developing slowly, but doesn't really kick in a huge way until after the Civil War. All right. But reducing trade dependency on Europe, more of a goal really of the North and the Midwestern states, because the Midwestern states were also exporting some grain crops overseas. Some internal improvements are created, but the system never really develops because the Jackson administration was not interested. And they're upcoming and they're not going to do it. And the Jackson administration also opposed the National Bank in a very strong way, which you'll notice when we talk about it next time. All right, more stuff. I know you've already done the John Marshall question, and some of you talked about McCulloch versus Maryland and talked about, I don't know, I'm going to say out loud, some of you wrote some odd things in your, I can't even think of what I'm trying to say, in your John Marshall answer. Like you would write the judicial review is important, but not explain what it was. And then you would list the cases and that sort of stuff. What was the other, I'm trying to think what the other peculiar thing that I kept reading in the John Marshall answers. Maybe it was something, maybe it was a different answer that I'm thinking of. But as far as John Marshall's value as a Federalist, remember, by this time, we're talking 1819 when we see McCulloch and some of the other rulings, Gibbon versus Ogden and Dartmouth College versus Woodward, which were the four, you know, pretty along with Marbury versus Madison, which was much earlier. But these three cases happen during this era, and the Federalist Party is gone. So that push for a stronger central government and a stronger pro-business faction is gone within the political spectrum. So here you have a Supreme Court justice, the Chief Justice, who writes a lot of these rulings as well. Oh, now I remember what it was. But he writes a lot of these rulings, and he's also really the strongest Federalist voice because there is no more Federalist Party. So he's going to keep the federal government stronger in an era where most of the politicians don't want it to be as strong. It's part of the reason that moving forward in the Jackson era, you're going to see Jackson just ignore Supreme Court rulings. And one of you mentioned too, that Jefferson thought that was okay too. He thought it was okay to ignore the Supreme Court. In the modern era, if you ignore the Supreme Court, we probably are going to impeach you, to be honest. That's probably what will happen. But during this era, if you ignore the Supreme Court, it depends on if you are more popular than the Supreme Court. When Andrew Jackson does it, Jackson's wildly popular. So we're going to keep him, and just, you'll see the Supreme Court decline a little bit in their influence during the Jackson administration. And I thought of what I now remember. It was the idea of original jurisdiction to the Supreme Court, because a couple of you wrote about Marbury versus Madison, and you talked about how it finally made it to the Supreme Court, and it went directly to the Supreme Court. There are some cases where, and I may have written that in a comment, but I surely wouldn't take off points for that, because you know, as a 1301 history student, we don't talk about original jurisdiction. I assume maybe it came up in a government class, but it may not have come up in a government class because that completely depends on who teaches the government class and if their emphasis is more on the Congress or the presidency or the Supreme Court. And I think of those three, usually the government classes sort of skim over the Supreme Court. I could be wrong about that. And I'm thinking especially the high school government classes, because I think they really like to talk about Congress and the presidency. And I get that because that does matter more on a day-to-day basis. But anyway, most cases in the modern era are appellate cases that do get referred to the Supreme Court. So, you know, you go to court, you lose, you appeal to a state court, then a district court, then a federal court of appeals, and then you appeal to the Supreme Court, and then they take it or they don't take it. There are a few cases that have original jurisdiction to the Supreme Court. Marbury versus Madison was one of those. McCulloch versus Maryland is one as well, where that goes directly or very quickly with McCulloch, I think. But with Marbury, it had original jurisdiction, which means it goes directly to the Supreme Court. And that happens when you have a problem with the federal government, when a state has a problem with the federal government, or when two different states have problems with each other, or if the United States has problems, or a foreign country has problems with the United States. So there are certain cases that just go directly to the Supreme Court. Marbury versus Madison was one of those for a variety of reasons. It was dealing with federal law, and it was dealing with the application of federal law or a request of an application of federal law by somebody who had a problem with the executive branch. So if I pointed out that Marbury was original jurisdiction, that's what I mean. It went directly to the Supreme Court. Hopefully I explained that well enough if I wrote that to you. McCulloch versus Maryland, you've got a state and the federal government having beef, as it were. There's a branch of the National Bank in Baltimore. The state of Maryland wanted to levy what was essentially a property tax or business tax on this branch of the national government, of the National Bank. The National Bank said, we don't do that. We don't pay state taxes. And Maryland said, yeah, we think you do. The Supreme Court says, no, they don't. So the Supreme Court in McCulloch establishes the idea that if there's a conflict in federal and state law, then federal law always wins. And I think this is still pretty relevant stuff because sometimes federal and state law conflict. Two things that are in the news, sorry, squirrel on the backyard or on the back porch. Two things that conflict about this right now that I think are in the news a lot. One is immigration related stuff. You know, there are certain cities that are sanctuary cities and they say, you know, we are not going to enforce immigration policy. And if we catch somebody that we know shouldn't be here legally, we're not going to call the immigration and customs, or what is ICE? I can't remember what it stands for. Isn't that terrible? I'm going to look it up. But we're not going to call the federal government and have anything enforced because, dang it, I'm looking it up. See what ICE says. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I was so close. I just forgot what the E was. All right, so we're not going to call ICE to have, you know, these guys taken away or put into custody. Also, you've probably heard about this. There's some states that legalize certain things that Texas doesn't legalize. Like I had a friend that told me they were going to go to Colorado and bring me a small gift. And I said, don't bring any small gifts back from Colorado because those small gifts, one, clearly I drink Coke Zero. That's as wild as I get. But yeah, I don't want a small gift from anybody. Plus, those small gifts are not legal in Texas. They're just not. So, but the truth is, the federal government says that marijuana is illegal. So if the federal government, and I don't know who would be in charge of, I can't remember who does I guess the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, kind of decides that they want to go to Colorado and arrest everybody that has a marijuana dispensary. Technically, they could do it, even though they're following state law. There's a conflict between federal and state law. I really expect that sometime before you guys are finished with college, in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, that there's going to be a Supreme Court case about that sort of thing, because that's a definite conflict between federal and state law. So, I mean, these set precedents that still really kind of matter during the time, not that other precedents don't matter. And the secondary thing that McCulloch does, which really isn't the intention, is it reaffirms the constitutionality of the national bank. There are certain people, Andrew Jackson, who think that the Supreme Court should have said that the national bank was unconstitutional, that rather than hearing this case, they should have said, you know what, bank's not constitutional at all. So they don't have standing in the court and there's no reason to hear this case. And that's not what they said. So it indirectly reaffirms the constitutionality of the national bank because it ignores the idea that it might be unconstitutional. All right. Missouri Compromise. All right. I don't know. All that stuff's moderately interesting to me. I don't know how interesting it is at the end of the school day for you, though. Like, yeah, I'd rather watch the squirrel like you were doing a second ago. I was watching the squirrel. My neighbor's 100-pound dog got out one day and came on the back porch, too. I think my back porch is a very popular area for the neighborhood wild animals and escaped pets. So, raccoon one day, very interesting. All right, Missouri Compromise. Yeah, in Missouri, they eat raccoons for dinner and squirrels. I know this, my people. All right, so not everybody in Missouri does that, though, just my people from the Ozarks. And the sophisticated ones like me don't do it. Missouri Compromise, now you're going like, that's the first reason we shouldn't have let Missouri in, because they eat raccoons and squirrels. Gotta eat what you gotta eat sometimes. But Missouri was wanting to become a state, and they had met the requirements. They had the 50,000 people. They made the application. I think this happened. Sorry for being yelling. 1819, 1818, 1819, somewhere in there. So, and this is during the Monroe administration. Yeah. So we got the one party thing going on. So the Republicans are the only party. And the Missouri wants to come in as a state, and they apply for statehood, and they apply as a slave state. And I don't know if you're familiar with Missouri, because you should be. It's really the most important state in the Union, because I'm from there. But it's right in the middle of the country, just right in the middle. So you know where Texas is on the map. So you got Texas, and then Arkansas, and then Missouri. Missouri's right on top of Arkansas. It's only 2 states away, but they're pretty states. So it's a long drive. It's like 10 or 12 hours, because I make it from sometimes to go visit the homeland. And it'd be much longer back then. So Missouri's kind of in the middle of the country. It's the state that St. Louis and Kansas City are in. It's where Patrick Mahomes plays football. I hear he's quite good. So they want to become a state, but they apply as a slave state. So it's not exactly the South. It's kind of in the middle of the country. And when they apply, there's an even number of states. And during this era, we like having an even number of states because they make sure that there's an even split between slave and free states. So if you add a new slave state, then that means in certain votes, the Senate votes, and surely you get this now from modern politics if you're paying attention. Having an advantage in the Senate makes a huge difference. Right now we have the 50-50 split in the Senate. So if they have tie votes, the vice president, Kamala Harris, gets to break the tie votes. So they are always looking for tie votes because they want her to, they want her to break the vote. So this would give a built-in advantage to southern states, and that's the sectional divide during this time period. So when Missouri applies for statehood in the Senate, a senator named James Talmadge from New York, clearly not a slave state, says, you know what, having a new state would be cool, but only if you agree to get rid of slavery. So gradual emancipation, which a lot of northern and Midwestern states had either already done or were in the process of doing. And that typically freed people when they reached a certain age, or just freed every slave in a certain year, is kind of how that worked. So um, it would prohibit any new slave. So anybody who's born after that time period can't become a slave. And current slaves were freed at age 25. And if clearly that time lapse is to benefit the slave owner, there's definitely no slave in the world who said, you know what, if I could wait 4 or 5 more years to be free, that'd be great. No, everybody wants their freedom right away. This doesn't benefit the slave, it benefits the slaveholder. But the idea of gradual emancipation is not what Missouri wanted. So they said, heck no, we're not going to do that. And there's a big fight, and the Senate says we're not going to ratify Missouri's statehood application. Then the state of Maine decides to apply. And I know what some of you are thinking, why is Maine not a state already? It's already in the North. Wasn't it one of the original 13? It was not. It was considered territory owned by Massachusetts. And at this point, a bunch of people had moved in. So they decided, that Maine could apply as a free state and Missouri could apply as a slave state, and that would keep the balance. But they also thought, we don't want to have this argument again because it's really intensifying the sectional divide, the regional conflict. So we're going to make a deal as a part of the Missouri Compromise. So here's the stuff that happens in the Missouri Compromise. Thing number one, that's one, Missouri, it's my finger crooked. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Thing number two, Maine comes in as a free state. Thing number three, because they don't want to have this argument again, they're going to set a line, the 3630 line, and everything above that automatically a free state. Everything below that automatically a slave state. That way you don't even have to have the argument. It's just what it is. So if it's north of 3630, free, south of 3630, slave, with the obvious exception of Missouri, because the 3630 is the southern border of Missouri. So Missouri will be the only state after 1820 above 3630 that will be a slave state. Okay, so that's all the Missouri Compromise stuff right there. And Missouri also said, if you're free and Black, you can't come here. And that'll be a thing during this time period. A lot of slave states will pass laws like that because you've got rebellions that occur from time to time. And there'll be a big one in 1830, the Nat Turner Rebellion. And after that, a lot of slave states pass a lot of really big restrictions on free Blacks and just free movement of current slaves. So, but yeah, I forgot to mention the provision that Missouri prohibited free Blacks from entry because they didn't want anybody there that they thought might help slaves escape. Yeah. Missouri will also get frustrated when their neighbor Kansas wants to be a state and they want to be a free state because they think all their slaves will try to escape to Kansas, because they will. That's why they think that. They're right about that. Yeah. All right. So let's peek at the weekly question again. This seems like a good time to stop. Oh, I should mention this before we peek at the weekly question. Both Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams saw the westward expansion of slavery as the issue. I could have underlined that. I could have highlighted it. I could have bolded it. The issue that would prove most politically fatal to the Republic. So if anything was going to destroy the country, these two guys, plus many other guys, thought that slavery would be the thing. Jefferson calls it a fire bell in the night. And you're going, well, that's clever. Or you're going like, what the heck does that mean? That's what you're going. Fire bell in the night's the fire alarm. So like if you're asleep and then you've got the smoke detector kind of thing in your house and it goes off in the middle of the night, and it's not because the batteries need to be changed. That only happens in the middle of the night for some reason. But it startles you and it causes you to run out of your house and it causes great damage and stress and that sort of thing. So Jefferson sees it as the thing that could destroy the house, as it were. And Adams predicts that slavery would lead to civil war in the United States if we couldn't figure out a way to fix it legislatively. So seems like a pretty fair prediction for a guy in the 1820s. I mean, we can predict that now because we know that's actually what happened, but he predicted it before it happened. Yeah. All right, which is actually a prediction, isn't it? Yeah. All right. And I guess I could mention, I think in the other class I mentioned that the Monroe Doctrine is issued during the Monroe presidency. John Quincy Adams, who's the Secretary of State, writes it. And it's the idea that the United States wants to stay out of the developing alliances in Europe. So in response to being asked to join different alliances, we said, you know what, we're just going to stay in the West. You guys have your own hemisphere. You guys hang out in the East. So we want to interfere in your business, and you need to stay out of ours. So we ban essentially any future colonization by European nations in the Western Hemisphere. And we respond to that with a promise to stay out of European affairs. And they mostly just go like, aren't you the country that has a raft and a rowboat for a navy? I mean, they mostly just think it's kind of a joke, but we're pretty proud of it. It's like, because we're establishing ourselves as the ruling power in the Western Hemisphere. And we can probably do that because it's us in Canada. And you know, Canada just stays in their lane, quite literally, the cold lane up there. And you know, Mexico's just gotten its independence from whoever they got it from, Spain. They're going to get taken over by France, and they're going to have to get it from France as well a little bit later. It's tough when you have to keep fighting for your independence from who knows who. But lots of the Latin American countries got their independence from Spain in the 18 teens and 20s. So we're issuing the Monroe Doctrine, honestly, as European countries are leaving our hemisphere anyway. So it's like, get out and don't come back is kind of what we're saying. And then you guys fight with each other there, and then we're going to try to mess with the neighbors here. We also are a little concerned that maybe France or Russia are going to try to take over some of the land in the Northeast, but we're not overly concerned about it. We'll make some deals with, like we'll buy Alaska from Russia, and we'll make some deals with England about the borders in Oregon and Washington, the Oregon Territory later on. What is the, why can't I think the Gadsden? No, Gadsden Purchase is south. It's the, and Webster Ashburton is treaty in Maine. Oh, well, I'll think of it later, because next chapter, I think, is when we go over some of those treaties. All right. Yeah, we've talked about enough of that stuff, I think. Yeah, I think so. So we're proud of Monroe Doctrine. Everybody else thinks it's kind of funny. All the European nations, like, oh, that's cute. I would always tell students when I taught at Cedar Park High School that it was like, I don't know, it was back in the day when they had a really big offensive line coach. His name was Brandon Schmidt. He looked like he'd been to the weight room, 2 or 3 times a day. He was a really large fellow, and I think he had played offensive line when he played college football. So he's a big dude. And I would tell the students the Monroe Doctrine is like if I threatened you. It's like, hey, kids, shut up or I'll punch you. And kids would just laugh. It's like, yeah, that's going to happen. But Coach Schmidt couldn't say that in class because if he punched you, you would break. So, and you would see that as a real threat. So I would always tell the students, I'm the Monroe Doctrine in 1819. Coach Schmidt is the Monroe Doctrine after the Spanish-American War, when Teddy Roosevelt reminds us of Monroe Doctrine and says, oh, by the way, it's Coach Schmidt now, it's not Ms. Cerna. Yeah. I don't know, do you have a large football coach that teaches U.S. history at Cedar Park High School? Do you still have the tall, skinny guy? God, what was that guy's name? And the bald guy. You know what I'm saying? Josh was the bald guy's name. What is Josh's last name? I hate that I can't remember stuff. But anyway, he taught at somebody's middle school. But all right, back to business. We're looking at the weekly question. I'm so glad I recorded all that stuff because that's cool. I can't remember Josh's last name. I should look on my phone. I'm sure I have his phone number. All right, so our question was the admittance of Missouri to the Union sparked a national crisis. Describe the debates that led up to the final compromise. How does the Missouri Compromise illustrate that sectional issues would surely arise again? Now, if I were you, go ahead and start working on this a little bit, and the page numbers are in the chat. But here's some things I'd be sure to include. Be sure to include these things. Talk about when this is happening. Okay, so give me some dates. I always like dates because, it's history and we like to know when stuff happens. Talk about what the sectional crisis is, or the sectional issue, how it's north versus south. South, I think I said slouth, but north versus south, and it involves slavery. Talk about the Talmadge Amendment, the idea that Missouri could come in if they got rid of slavery. And then, of course, talk about the establishment of the 3630 line, the idea that Missouri got to come in because Maine came in as a free state, and how that's probably going to establish two conditions moving forward. One, that there's not going to be any discussion about whether a state is slave or free. They're just going to look 3630 line below or above. And two, we're probably going to let in two states at a time so we can avoid conflict, a slave and a free state. But the page numbers 376 to 378 will help you with a little bit more detail. I think this one pretty straightforward, but you gotta put the stuff in. You gotta talk about the date. You gotta talk about Missouri as a slave state. You've got to talk about the Talmadge Amendment. You've got to talk about Maine coming in, and you've got to talk about the 3630 line. All that stuff's got to be in there because it's kind of a small question. So you got to have all the stuff. And it's a really small section in the book to look at, 376 to 378. Plus, there's like a map or two in there. So it's not even all text. You know what I'm saying? Oh, speaking of maps, there's also a map in there, 380, that shows all the formerly Spanish-owned colonies that gained their independence during that time period. So maps, it's a good map chapter. All right, I don't know if it's time to go. Seems a little early. I don't know. You want to stay? Is there anything you want to talk about? Before we go, I will double check the roll for a second. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording.